好啦，我哋今次第六次錄音啦，咁讀呢個第七節嘅遠大前程。上回講到邊度記唔記得？
唔記得哦。
上一次呢，就係講到阿 pip 跟住啲士兵去捉呢啲逃犯啊嘛，好長嘅。將所有動作嘅片段咧，全部收錄喺同一節嗰度啦。佢哋Dickens 係嘛，一路去到由出發去捉佢哋，到捉佢哋，到捉到佢哋，到喺度講嘢係咪啊？個逃犯我督佢出嚟啊嘛，督阿 pip 出嚟啊嘛，嘗試。咁但係俾佢姐夫化解咗啊嘛，然之後點啊？然之後捉咗嗰個逃犯翻上船咯。跟住之後就係我哋上一次讀嗰一節第六節就係點咧？就係佢翻屋企，然之後翻屋企邊個喺度咧？所有人都喺度，唔係淨係佢家姐。之前嗰啲 Mr. Wopsle 啊，啲全部喺度咯。咩 uncle 啊？仲有嗰兩夫婦啊，都喺度咯。佢喺度講咩啊？就喺度講，真係執翻身彩啦，係嘛？
佢哋係咪喺度諗點解？
係啦，同埋唔喺度諗個批點解會俾佢落咗喺呢個囚犯嘅手度咧？有冇真正考慮過阿 pip 嘅聯繫咧？其實係冇嘅。咁咯，咁阿 pip 亦都死都唔講啦，當然唔傻啊，佢都即係佢唔會因為大家讚許佢做嗰啲嘢喎，走去捉咗個犯翻嚟，幫手捉個犯翻嚟就好 high 咁樣自己喺度爆晒，唔會嘅。阿 pip 唔係一個咁嘅細路仔嚟嘅 ，OK？ 阿 pip 係守口如瓶，死都唔講。OK 就係咁咯。咁佢有提過佢家姐啦，即係都係有少少即係唔滿意佢啦，即係覺得一係就覺得佢搶風頭啦，一係就覺得佢礙眼啦。總之就唔想去喺嗰啲人面前，啲人加許佢，所以就捉走佢細佬啦。就係咁啫，即係叫佢翻去瞓啦，你唔好阻住晒。就係咁啫嘛。即係一段咁短嘅，其實就係交代事後啫嘛，一啲文氣。交代大家一啲round up 就係咁啫嘛，冇啦，又打喊路，真係好啦。Chapter 7啦，好冇？咁Chapter 7即係話咩？即係一個新嘅展開啦，係咪啊？因為連事後戲都冇埋啦，係咪？仲會有啲咩？應該係發展一個新嘅，完全一個新嘅開端啦。OK， 好啦，開始啦。At a time when I stood in the churchyard reading the family tombstones,I had just enough learning to be able to spell them out. My construction even of their simple meaning was not very correct, for I read wife of the above as a complimentary reference to my father's exaltation to a better world. And if any one of my deceased relations had been referred to as below, I have no doubt I should have formed the worst opinions of that member of the family. Neither were my notions of the theological positions to which my catechism bound me at all accurate, for I have a lively remembrance that I supposed my declaration that I was to walk in the same all the days of my life laid me under an obligation always to go through the village from our house in one particular direction, and never to vary it by turning down by the wheelwrights or up by the mill. When I was old enough, I was to be apprenticed to Joe, and until I could assume that dignity, I was not to be what Mrs. Joe called pompied or pampered. Therefore, I was not only odd boy about the forge, but if any neighbor happened to want an extra boy to frighten birds or pick up stones or do any such job, I was favored with the employment. In order, however, that our superior position might not be compromised thereby, a money box was kept on a kitchen mantel shelf, into which it was publicly made known that all my earnings were dropped. I have an impression that they were to be contributed eventually towards liquidation of the national debt, and I know I had no hope of any personal participation in the treasure. 即係賺啲錢返嚟冇佢份使嘅。Mr. Wopsle's great aunt kept an evening school in the village. That is to say, she was a ridiculous old woman of limited means and unlimited infirmity, who used to go to sleep from 6 to 7 every evening in a society of youth who paid 2 pence per week each for the improving opportunity of seeing her do it. She rented a small cottage, and Mr. Wopsle had a room upstairs where we students used to overhear him reading out loud in a most dignified and terrific manner, and occasionally bumping on the ceiling. There was a fiction that Mr. Wopsle examined the scholars once a quarter. What he did on those occasions was to turn up his cuffs, stick up his hair, and give us Mark Antony's oration over the body of Caesar. This was always followed by Collins's ode on the passions, wherein I particularly venerated Mr. Wopsle as refuge, as revenge, throwing his blood-stained sword in Thunderdown, and taking the war-denouncing trumpet with a withering look. It was not with me then, as it was in later life, when I fell into the society of the passions and compared them with Collins and Wopsle, rather to the disadvantage of both gentlemen. Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, besides keeping this educational institution, kept in the same room in a little general shop. She had no idea what stock she had or what the price of anything in it was, but there was a little greasy memorandum book kept in a drawer, which served as a catalogue of prices, and by this oracle Biddy arranged all the shop transactions. Biddy was Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's granddaughter. I confess myself quite unequal to the working out of the problem, what relation she was to Mr. Wopsle. She was an orphan like myself, like me too, had been brought up by hand. She was most noticeable, I thought, in respect of her extremities, for her hair always wanted brushing, her hands always wanted washing, and her shoes always wanted mending and pulling up at heel. This description must be received with a weekday limitation. On Sundays, she went to church elaborated. Much of my unassisted self, and more by the help of Biddy than of Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, I struggled through the alphabet as if it had been a bramble bush, getting considerably worried and scratched by every letter. After that, I fell among those thieves, the 9 figures, who seemed every evening to do something new to disguise themselves and baffle recognition. But at last I began, in a purblind, groping way, to read, write, and cipher on the very smallest scale. One night, I was sitting in a chimney corner with my slate, expending great efforts on the production of a letter to Joe. I think it must have been a full year after our hunt upon the marshes, for it was a long time after, and it was winter and a hard frost. 呢度聽唔聽得到啊？過咗一年㗎啦，已經。捉賊過咗一年啦，捉逃犯之後已經過咗一年㗎啦。Okay? With an alphabet on the hearth of my feet for reference, I contrived in an hour or two to print and smear this epistle. 佢有一段嘢寫一啲嘢喺度啦，但係佢係啲英文唔好，所以唔知佢寫咩咯。My dear Joe, I hope you are quite well. I hope I shall soon be able to teach you, Joe, and then we should be so glad. And when I'm presented to you, Joe, what laughs and believe me in and pip. 即係完全係好差啲英文。There was no indispensable necessity for my communicating with Joe by letter, inasmuch as he sat beside me and we were alone. But I delivered this written communication with my own hand, and Joe received it as a miracle of erudition. I say, Pip, old chap, cried Joe, opening his blue eyes wide. What a scholar you are, ain't you? I should like to be, said I, glancing at the slate as he held it. with a misgiving that the writing was rather hilly. Why, here's a J, said Joe, and an O equal to anything. There's a Joe and an O, Pip, and a J-O, Joe. I never heard Joe read out loud to any greater extent than this monosyllable, and I had observed at church last Sunday when I accidentally held my prayer book upside down that it seemed to suit his convenience quite as well as if it had been all right. Wishing to embrace the present occasion of finding out whether in teaching Joe I should have to begin quite at the beginning, I said, but read the rest, Joe. The rest, eh, Pip? Said Joe, looking at it with a slow, searching eye. 1, 2, 3. Why, here's 3 J's, the 3 O's, and 3 J-O. Joe's in it, Pip. I leaned over Joe, and with the aid of my forefinger reading him the whole letter. Astonishing, said Joe, when I had finished. You are a scholar. How do you spell Gregory, Joe? I asked him with a modest patronage. I don't spell it at all, said Joe. But supposing you did? It can't be supposed, said Joe, though I'm uncommon fond of reading too. Are you, Joe? Uncommon. Give me, said Joe, a good book or a good newspaper and sit me down for a good fire, and I ask no better. Lord, he continued, after rubbing his knees a little, when you do come to J and an O, I ask and says you, here at last is a J-O, Joe. How interesting reading is. I derived from this that Joe's education, like steam, was yet in its infancy. Pursuing the subject, I inquired, didn't you ever go to school, Joe, when you were as little as me? No, Pip. Why didn't you ever go to school, Joe, when you were as little as me? Well, Pip, said Joe, taking up the poker and settling himself to his usual occupation when he was thoughtful, of slowly raking the fire between the lower bars. I'll tell you. My father, Pip, he was given to drink, and when he were overtook with drink, he hammered away at my mother, most unmerciful. It were most the only hammering he did, indeed, except at myself, and he hammered at me with a vigor only to be equaled by the vigor with which he didn't hammer at his anvil. You're listening and understanding, Pip? Yes, Joe. Consequence, my mother and me ran away from my father several times, and then my mother, she'd go out to work, and she'd say, Joe, she'd say, now please God, you shall have some schooling, child, and she'd put me to school. My father were that good in his art that he couldn't bear to be without us, so he'd come with a most tremendous crowd and make such a row at the doors in the house where he was, that we used to be obligated to have no more to do with us and to give us up to him. And then he took us home and hammered us, which, you see, Pip, said Joe, pausing in his meditative raking of the fire and looking at me, were a drawback on my learning. Certainly, poor Joe. Though mind you, Pip, said Joe, with a judicial touch of two of the poker on the top bar, rendering unto all their due, the maintaining equal justice betwixt man and man, my father, were that good in his heart, don't you see? I didn't see, but I didn't say so. Well, Joe pursued, somebody must keep that pot of billing, Pip, or the pot won't bile, don't you know? I saw that and said so. Consequence, my father didn't make objections to my going to work, so I went to work at my present calling, which were his too, if he would have followed it, and I worked tolerable hard, I assure you, Pip. In time, I were able to keep him, and I kept him till he went off in a purple leptic fit. And it were my intentions to have had put upon his tombstones that what some of the failings on his part, remember, reader, he were that good in his heart. Joe recited this couplet with such manifest pride and careful perspicuity that I asked him if he had made it himself. I made it, said Joe, my own self. I made it in a moment. It was like striking out a horseshoe complete in a single blow. I never was so much surprised in all my life. Couldn't credit my own head, to tell you the truth. Hardly believe it were my own head. As I was saying, Pip, it were my intentions to have had it cut over him. But poetry costs money. Cut it how you will, small or large, and it were not done. Not to mention bearers, all the money that could be spared were wanted for my mother. She were in poor health and quite broke. She weren't long of following, poor soul, and she shared with peace come round at last. Joe's blue eyes turned a little watery. She rubbed first of them and then the other, in a most uncongenial and uncomfortable manner, with the round knob on the top of the poker. "It were but lonesome then," said Joe, "living here alone, and I got acquainted with your sister. Now, Pip," Joe looked firmly at me as if he knew I was not going to agree with him, "your sister is a fine figure of a woman." I could not help looking at the fire in an obvious state of doubt. "Whatever family opinions or whatever the world's opinions on that subject may be, Pip, your sister is," Joe tapped the top bar with the poker after every word following, "a fine figure of a woman." I could think of nothing better to say than, "I am glad you think so, Joe." "So am I," returned Joe, catching me up. "I'm glad I think so, Pip. A little redness or a little matter of bone here and there, what does it signify to me?" I sagaciously observed, if it didn't signify to him, to whom did it signify? "Certainly," asserted Joe. "That's it. You're right, old chap. When I got acquainted with your sister, it were to talk how she was bringing you up by hand. Very kind of her, too. All the folks said, and I said, along with all the folks, as to you," Joe pursued with a countenance expressive of seeing something very nasty indeed. "If you could have been aware how small and flabby and mean you was, dear me, you'd have formed the most contemptible opinion of yourself." Not exactly relishing this, I said, "Never mind me, Joe." "But I did mind you, Pip," he returned with tender simplicity. "When I offered to your sister to keep company and to be asked in church at such times as she was willing and ready to come to the forge, I said to her, 'And bring the poor little child. God bless the poor little child,' I said to your sister. 'There's room for him at the forge.'" I broke out crying and begging pardon and hugged Joe around the neck, who dropped the poker to hug me and to say, "Ever the best of friends, ain't us, Pip? Don't cry, old chap." When this little interruption was over, Joe resumed, "Well, you see, Pip, and here we are. That's about where it lights. Here we are. Now, when you take me in hand in my learning, Pip, Mrs. Joe mustn't see too much of what we're up to. It must be done, as I may say, on the sly. And why on the sly? I'll tell you why, Pip." He had taken up the poker again, without which I doubt if he could have proceeded in his demonstration. "Your sister is given to government." "Given to government, Joe?" I was startled, for I had some shadowy idea that Joe had divorced her in favor of the lords of the Admiralty or Treasury. "Given to government," said Joe, "which I meant to say the government of you and myself." "Oh, and she ain't over partial to having scholars on the premise," she continued, "and in particular would not be over partial to my being a scholar, for fear as I might rise, like a sort of rebel, don't you see?" I was going to retort with an inquiry, and had got as far as why, when Joe stopped me. "Stay a bit. I know what you're going to say, Pip. Stay a bit. I don't deny that your sister comes the mogul over us now and again. I don't deny that she do throw us backfalls and that she do drop down upon us heavy. At such times as when your sister is on the rampage, Pip." Joe sank his voice to a whisper and glanced at the door. "Candle compels fur to admit that she is a buster." Joe pronounced this word as if it began with at least 12 capital B's. "Why don't I rise? That were your observation when I broke it off, Pip." "Yes, Joe." "Well," said Joe, passing the poker into his left hand that he might feel his whisker, and I had no hope of him whenever he took to that placid occupation. "Your sister's a mastermind. A mastermind." "What's that?" I asked, in some hope of bringing him to a stand. But Joe was readier with his definition than I had expected, and completely stopped me by arguing circularly and answering with a fixed look. "Her." "And I ain't a mastermind," Joe resumed, when he had unfixed his look and got back to his whisker. "And last of all, Pip, and this I want to say very serious to you, old chap, I see so much in my poor mother of a woman drudging and slaving and breaking her honest heart and never getting no peace in her mortal days, that I'm dead afeard of going wrong in the way of not doing that's right by a woman, and I'd rather of the two go wrong the other way, and be a little ill-convenienced myself. I wish it was only me that got put out, Pip. I wish there weren't no tickler for you, old chap. I wish I could take it all on myself, but this is the up and down and straight on it, Pip, and I hope you overlook shortcomings. Young as I was, I believe that I dated a new admiration of Joe from that night. We were equal afterwards, as we had been before, but afterwards, at quiet times when I sat looking at Joe and thinking about him, I had a new sensation of feeling conscious that I was looking up to Joe in my heart. However, said Joe, rising to replenish the fire, he is the Dutch clock a-working himself up to being equal to strike 8 of them, and she's not come home yet. I hope Uncle Pumblecock's mare may not have set a forefoot on a piece of ice and gone down. Mrs. Joe made occasional trips with Uncle Pumblecock on market days to assist him in buying such household stuffs and goods as required a woman's judgment. Uncle Pumblecock being a bachelor and reposing no confidences in his domestic servant. This was market day, and Mrs. Joe was out on one of these expeditions. Joe made the fire and swept the heath, and then he went to the door to listen for the chaise cart. It was a dry old night, and the wind blew keenly, and the frost was white and hard. A man would die tonight of lying out in the marshes, I thought, and then I looked at the stars, and considered how awful it would be for a man to turn his face up to them as he froze to death, and see no help or pity in all the glittering multitude. 仲爭少少讀埋啦。Here comes the mare, said Joe, ringing like a pearl of bells. The sound of her iron shoes upon the hard road was quite musical as she came along at a much brisker trot than usual. We got a chair out, ready for Mrs. Joe's alighting, and stirred up the fire that they might see a bright window, and took a final survey of the kitchen that nothing might be out of its place. When we had completed these preparations, they drove up wrapped to the eyes. Mrs. Joe was soon landed, and Uncle Pumblecock was soon down too, covering the mare with cloth. And we were soon all in the kitchen, carrying so much cold air in with us that it seemed to drive out all the heat out of the fire. Now, said Mrs. Joe, unwrapping herself with haste and excitement, and throwing her bonnet back on her shoulders where it hung by the strings, if this boy ain't grateful this night, he never will be. I looked as grateful as any boy possibly could, who was wholly uninformed why he ought to assume that expression. It's only to be hoped, said my sister, that he won't be pomp-eyed, but I have my fears. She ain't in that line, Mum, said Mr. Pumblecock. She knows better. She? I looked at Joe, making the motion with my lips and eyebrows. She? Joe looked at me, making the motion with his lips and eyebrows. She? My sister catching him in the act. He drew the back of his hand across his nose with his usual conciliatory air on such occasions, and looked at her. Well, said my sister in her snappish way, what are you staring at? Is this house afire? Which some individual, Joe politely hinted, mentioned she. And she is a she, I suppose, said my sister, unless you call Miss Havisham a he, and I doubt if even you go so far as that. Miss Havisham uptown, said Joe. Is there any Miss Havisham downtown? Returned my sister. She wants this boy to go and play there, and of course he's going, and he had better play there, said my sister, shaking her head at me as an encouragement to be extremely light and sportive, or I'll work him. I had heard of Miss Havisham uptown. Everybody for miles round had heard of Miss Havisham uptown as an immensely rich and grim lady who lived in a large and dismal house barricaded against robbers, and who led a life of seclusion. Well, to be sure, said Joe, astounded. I wonder how she come to know Pip. Noodle, cried my sister. Who said she know him? Which some individual, Joe again politely hinted, mentioned that she wanted him to go and play there. And couldn't she ask Uncle Pumblecook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? Isn't it just barely possible that Uncle Pumblecook may be a tenant of hers and that he may sometimes, we won't say quarterly or half-yearly, for that would be requiring too much of you, but sometimes go there to pay his rent? And couldn't she then ask Uncle Pumblecook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? And couldn't Uncle Pumblecook maybe always considerate and thoughtful for us, though you may not think it, Joseph, in a tone of deepest reproach, as if he were the most callous of nephews, then mention this boy standing prancing here, which I solemnly declare I was not doing, that I have forever been a willing slave to. Good again, cried Uncle Pumblecook. Well put, prettily pointed, good indeed. Now, Joseph, you know the case. No, Joseph, said my sister, still in a reproachful manner, while Joe apologetically drew the back of his hand across his nose. You do not yet, though you may not think it, know the case. You may consider that you do, but you do not, Joseph. For you do not know that Uncle Pumblecook, being sensible that for anything we can tell, this boy's fortune may be made by his going to Miss Havisham's, has offered to take him into town tonight in his own chaise cart, and to keep him tonight, and to take him with his own hands to Miss Havisham's tomorrow morning. And Lord mercy me, cried my sister, casting off her bonnet in sudden desperation. Here I stand talking to mere mooncalves, with Uncle Pumblecook waiting, and the mare catching cold at the door, and the boy grimed with crock and shit with the hair of his head on to the sole of his foot. With that, she pounced upon me like an eagle on the lamb, and my face was squeezed into wooden bowls and sinks, and my head was put under taps of water butts, and I was soaked and kneaded and toweled and thumped and harrowed and rasped until I really was quite beside myself. When my ablutions were completed, I was put into clean linen of the stiffest character, like a young penitent into sackcloth, and was trussed up in my tightest and fearfulest suit. I was then delivered over to Mr. Pumblecook, who formally received me as if he were the sheriff, and who let off upon me the speech that I knew he had been dying to make all along. Boy, be forever grateful to all friends, but especially unto them which brought you up by hand. Goodbye, Joe. God bless you, Pip, old chap. I had never parted from him before, and what with my feelings and what with soap suds, I could at first see no stars from the chaise cart, but they twinkled out one by one, without throwing any light on the questions why on earth I was going to play at Miss Havisham's, and what on earth I was expected to play at. 知唔知發生咩事啊？知唔知發生咩事啊？好多嘢都係講嘅啫，其實唔係好多嘢發生。即係轉眼間1年就過去咗啦，新嘅展開啦。OK， 咁一開始就講翻阿 Pip 都依然喺度幫手啦，賺錢啦，但係啲錢賺翻嚟佢冇份使嘅啦，即係都係幫人哋做下跑腿啊、打下鐵啊咁咯。咁啊有一晚就同阿 Jo 喺度傾偈啊，講阿 Jo 嘅身世咯。咁啊問阿 Jo 點解你完全唔識字啊，又唔識讀啊？咁啊 Jo 咪話佢老豆成日打佢咯，打到佢同佢媽咪離家出走咯。但係之後佢老豆又會去捉佢翻嚟咯，又再毒打佢哋咯。咁啊永遠都讀唔到書咯。咁啊 Pip 就覺得佢好慘咯。然之後，但係佢唔，但係阿 Jo 唔覺得佢呢樣嘢慘，佢覺得佢阿媽慘，係咯。跟住阿媽 pass away 咗啦，咁咯。咁然之後佢就遇到佢家姐，然之後就不停咁讚佢家姐啦。咁就係話，佢話我知道有陣時你家姐都會對我哋點樣。佢話但係我都係覺得佢好嘅，始終佢都係有佢好嘅一面。即係佢阿 Jo 係一個好識得即係將個心機擺喺人哋好嘅一面，而唔係 focus 喺人哋唔好嘅一面嗰度。即係 Jo 係一個咁樣嘅人，比較寬宏大量嘅一個人。 咁而阿 Pip 亦都覺得佢好值得學習嘅呢一樣嘢。而喺呢個時候咧，佢家姐就翻嚟啦。佢家姐同邊個翻嚟咧？佢家姐係同阿 Uncle Pumblechook 翻嚟。咁點解佢兩個會出咗咧？原來阿 Pumblechook 就係一個 bachelor 嚟嘅。OK， 咁佢有陣時要去街市買嘢嗰啲咧，佢需要佢家姐幫手嘅。每個禮拜都要佢家姐都會陪佢買。咁實情係咪咁？我唔知啦。總之佢就咁講啦。咁嗰一晚咧就佢哋就翻嚟啦。然之後咧佢哋就帶個 news 翻嚟，就係咧佢哋收到消息咧就係咧住喺個鎮偏遠地方有個女人叫做 Miss Havisham。咁呢個女人咧好有錢嘅，咁但係佢怪脾氣嘅，自己一個人住嘅啫。OK， 咁啊冇乜人知佢搞咩，淨係知佢好有錢。咁咧 somehow 咧呢一個 Pumblechook 咧就同呢個 Havisham 咧就有啲關係嘅。OK， 咁而咧呢個 Havisham 咧就話佢好想同小朋友玩喎。OK， 可能佢好孤獨啦，定唔知咩？呢度冇解釋到嘅。跟住之後阿 Pumblechook 咧就提咗，喂，我識個細路仔叫阿 Pip 喎，不如帶佢嚟同你玩啦咁樣。咁跟住咧，咁呢個阿 Pip 個家姐就話，喂，呢個係好好嘅機會啊！發達就係睇呢一鋪啦。喂，如果佢阿 Havisham 中意咗你嘅話，咁你萬一可以繼承遺產，咪不得了，即係有啲咁嘅意味喺度啦。OK， 咁你哋仲喺度問長問短，喺度做咩啊？收聲啦，快啲過去啦咁樣。咁於是乎咧，就即刻就同阿 Pip 就梳洗到佢好乾淨，俾套 suit 佢着，將佢包裝到同平時完全唔一樣嘅，然之後就擁佢上車，就俾阿 Pumblechook 就送去俾Miss Havisham， 但係 Miss Havisham， 但係其實阿 Pip 係完全唔明，亦都唔知發生咩事。佢唔明就係點解呢個女人要想同我玩咧？你明唔明啊？即係有好多細路仔㗎，咁點解係我咧？咁係咪真係純粹因為 Pumblechook 嘅關係咧？但係定係背後有啲咩隱情咧？而家係冇講嘅，只不過係有好多疑問喺度咯。即係究竟呢個 Havisham 想點啊？又或者阿 Pumblechook 佢背後係咪有啲咩利益喺度啊？但係當然呢樣嘢阿 Pip 就唔會識諗啦。Pip 淨係喺度諗做咩啊？發生咩事啊 ？Havisham 想我點啊？咁咯。但係佢亦都知道佢係去一個好有錢嘅女人屋企，着到好靚，有個馬車去接佢嘅。咁佢亦都話第一次同阿 Jo 分開啦。咁佢要自己一個上路。咁咯，呢個就係一個新嘅展開。OK， 講呢度先，我哋下次再講。OK，拜拜。